Father follows neighbor into woods. His discovery is terrifying. Martin wasn't the type of guy who went looking for trouble. At 40, he had pretty much figured out what he wanted from life. A quiet house in the suburbs, a stable job in IT that let him work from home, and plenty of time with his 10-year-old son, Ben. Their neighborhood was exactly what you'd expect. Neat lawns, well-kept gardens, and enough space between houses that you didn't have to worry about your TV being too loud at night. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Working from home meant Martin saw a lot of what went on in the neighborhood during the day. He knew when Mrs. Patterson from across the street got her weekly grocery delivery, and how the guy 2 doors down always forgot to bring in his trash cans until the evening. It wasn't that he was nosy. These things just became part of the background of his daily life, like the way his coffee maker sometimes made weird noises or how Ben always left his shoes in the middle of the hallway. Most of his neighbors were just faces he'd wave to while getting the mail or taking out the trash. There was an unspoken agreement in the neighborhood. Keep your lawn neat, don't make too much noise, and mind your own business. It worked well enough. Martin knew a few names, shared occasional small talk about the weather, and that was about it. The only time people really got together was during the annual block party or when someone needed to borrow a ladder. The woods behind their houses added a nice touch to the whole suburban setup. The trees created a natural barrier that made the neighborhood feel private and peaceful. During the day, you could sometimes hear kids playing back there, building forts, or whatever kids did these days when they weren't glued to their phones. Ben used to be one of them, but lately, he'd gotten more interested in video games, much to Martin's mild disappointment. That's probably why Martin started noticing Greg's behavior in the first place. He spent a lot of time looking out his home office window, taking breaks between fixing computer problems for people who mostly needed to restart their machines. Greg lived in the gray house 3 doors down, the one with the perfectly trimmed hedges and the dark blue shutters. He was one of those neighbors Martin knew just enough about to say hello to, but not enough to remember what he did for a living. At first, Greg's evening walks didn't seem weird at all. Lots of people in the neighborhood had their routines. There was the morning jogger lady in the bright yellow shorts, the old couple who walked their tiny dog exactly at noon, and the teenager who practiced skateboard tricks in his driveway after school. Greg's thing just happened to be walking into the woods right before sunset, carrying a small bag that looked like something you'd pack a lunch in. Martin probably wouldn't have thought twice about it if Greg had gone for his walks like everyone else, wearing workout clothes, maybe with some earbuds in, looking like he was trying to get his steps in for the day. But there was something off about the way Greg did it. He'd come out of his house looking over his shoulder, clutching that bag close to his body like he was afraid someone might try to grab it. He never wore exercise clothes, just regular pants and a shirt, sometimes a light jacket if it was cool out. And he always went right before the sun started to set. The whole thing started nagging at Martin's mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He found himself glancing out his window more often around sunset, just to see if Greg would appear. Sure enough, like clockwork, Greg would emerge from his house, bag in hand, heading straight for the narrow path that led into the woods. The predictability of it made it seem even stranger somehow. One evening, while Martin was helping Ben with his math homework at the kitchen table, a news alert popped up on his phone. Someone had gone missing from a town about 20 minutes away. The story wasn't particularly detailed, just another person who disappeared without any obvious signs of foul play. Martin tried to push it out of his mind, but somehow it got tangled up with thoughts of Greg and his mysterious evening walks. That night, after Ben went to bed, Martin found himself standing at his back window, staring at the woods. The trees looked different in the darkness, their branches creating weird shadows that seemed to move in the slight breeze. He thought about Greg somewhere out there, doing whatever it was he did with that bag, and felt a chill run down his spine. The rational part of his brain told him he was being ridiculous. Greg was probably just a guy who liked taking walks and maybe had some harmless hobby he preferred to do alone. But another part of his brain, the part that noticed patterns and couldn't let go of puzzles, kept wondering. The more Martin tried to ignore his curiosity about Greg's behavior, the more details he started noticing. Like how Greg always took the same path into the woods, even though there were several other well-worn trails that looked easier to walk. Or how he never came back until it was completely dark, sometimes not for hours. Martin caught himself making mental notes about these things and felt slightly embarrassed about it, like he was turning into one of those nosy neighbors he'd always tried not to be. During the day, Greg seemed normal enough. Martin would sometimes see him getting his mail or washing his car, and he'd act just like any other neighbor. He'd wave if he saw you, make small talk about the weather if you happened to be close enough. He lived alone, as far as Martin could tell, though sometimes a car would park in his driveway for a few hours, probably friends or family visiting. Nothing about daytime Greg suggested anything unusual, but as soon as the sun started to set, it was like watching a different person emerge. Greg's whole demeanor would change. His shoulders would hunch slightly, his movements would become more deliberate, and his eyes would dart around like he was making sure no one was watching. The bag never left his hand until he disappeared into the trees. Martin tried to distract himself with other things. He focused on work, spent more time playing video games with Ben, and even started teaching himself to cook proper meals instead of relying on takeout. But his mind kept wandering back to those evening walks. He'd find himself zoning out during conference calls, thinking about what could be in that bag. Sometimes he'd catch himself making up stories about it. Maybe Greg was an amateur photographer who liked taking pictures of the sunset, or perhaps he was leaving food for stray animals. The missing person case from the nearby town didn't help matters. Martin found himself reading more local news than usual, looking for updates. The story was pretty straightforward. A woman in her 30s had left work one evening and never made it home. Her car was found in a shopping center parking lot, with no signs of struggle. The police said they had no leads, and the woman's family was desperate for information. Martin knew it was crazy to connect Greg's walks with the missing person case. The logical part of his brain kept telling him he was letting his imagination run wild. People went for walks in the woods all the time. People carried bags. People liked their privacy. None of these things meant anything sinister was going on. But then he started noticing other little things, like how Greg's walks seemed to last longer on cloudy evenings when it got dark earlier, or how sometimes he'd come back with his clothes looking dirty, even though the main paths in the woods were well maintained. Once, Martin saw him return with what looked like scratches on his hands, though he couldn't be sure in the dim light. Sarah, Martin's wife, started noticing his preoccupation. She'd catch him staring out the window during dinner, or find him sitting in the dark after Ben had gone to bed, just watching the tree lean. "You're getting obsessed," she told him one night, half joking but with a note of concern in her voice. Martin tried to laugh it off, but he knew she was right. The woods had always been a normal part of their neighborhood's backdrop. During the day, they were just trees, a nice bit of nature that added value to their property and gave the kids a place to play. But now, especially in the evenings, Martin found himself looking at them differently. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more mysterious. The rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like whispers. He caught himself wondering what secrets those woods might be hiding. Ben noticed the change in his dad, too. "Why do you always look out the window now?" he asked one evening while they were playing Mario Kart. Martin had gotten distracted again, watching Greg's familiar figure disappear into the trees. "Just thinking, buddy," he'd answered, turning back to the game and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in his stomach. Martin knew he should probably just let it go. Greg's activities, whatever they were, weren't really any of his business. But something about the whole situation felt wrong, like a slightly off-key note in an otherwise normal song. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to demand his attention. The evening that changed everything started like any other. Martin was finishing up a late work call, half listening to a client explain why their printer wouldn't connect to the network, when movement caught his eye. Greg was practically running toward the woods, his usual careful scanning of the surroundings replaced by obvious anxiety. The bag swung wildly at his side as he moved, and even from a distance, Martin could tell something was different. This wasn't Greg's normal sunset timing. The sun had been down for almost an hour. Martin found himself reaching for a notepad, jotting down the time. 9:47 p.m. He didn't even think about why he was doing it. It just felt important somehow. The call ended, but Martin stayed at his window, watching the spot where Greg had disappeared into the darkness. Over the next few days, Martin started keeping track of Greg's comings and goings more systematically. He created a simple note on his phone, recording times and anything unusual he noticed. Some patterns started emerging. Greg's walks were getting later, and he seemed more agitated each time. The bag sometimes looked fuller than others, and occasionally Greg would make 2 trips in one evening, something he'd never done before. Sarah found Martin's phone open to the notes one morning while she was making coffee. She picked it up, probably thinking it was a grocery list or something for work. Instead, she found entries like, Tuesday, 9:32 p.m., dark clothes, bag looks heavy. Wednesday, skipped usual time, went at 10:15 p.m. instead. Thursday, 2 trips, 8:45 p.m. and 11:20 p.m., different bags second time. Martin, she called out, her voice careful but concerned. What is this? He tried to explain it without sounding crazy. Told her about Greg's changing patterns, the increasing urgency in his behavior, the way he'd started looking almost haunted when he returned from his walks. To his surprise, Sarah didn't immediately tell him he was being paranoid. Instead, she sat down at the kitchen table, coffee forgotten, and asked him to tell her everything he'd noticed. Remember that rainy night last week? She asked after he finished. When we had that huge storm? Martin nodded. I was up late reading, and I saw Greg coming back. His clothes were covered in mud, like he'd been digging or something. I thought it was weird at the time, but I figured maybe he'd slipped on the wet ground. Martin felt his stomach tighten. In the middle of the night? During a storm? Sarah shook her head slowly. That's not all. A few days ago, I was getting the mail when he was leaving. He dropped his bag, and something fell out. It looked like some kind of tool, but not like garden tools or anything normal. It was sharper. When he saw me looking, he shoved it back in the bag so fast I couldn't get a good look, but it definitely wasn't something you'd take on a casual walk. They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking about the implications. Martin's notes suddenly seemed less like the product of an overactive imagination and more like documentation of something genuinely disturbing. The rational explanations he'd been trying to convince himself of started to feel thin and inadequate. We should watch him, Sarah said finally. Both of us. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe there's a perfectly good explanation for all of this. But if there isn't, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. That night, they took turns watching from different windows of their house. Ben was at a sleepover, which made it easier to focus on their self-appointed surveillance. Greg left at his now usual later time, moving quickly through the shadows between the streetlights. The bag looked particularly full, its sides straining against whatever was inside. When Greg returned 3 hours later, Martin and Sarah watched him from their darkened living room window. His clothes were dirty again, and he seemed to be favoring his right arm, holding it close to his body as he walked. The bag looked lighter now, almost empty. As he passed under a streetlight, they could see dark stains on his pants that might have been mud, or might have been something else. We need to figure out what he's doing out there, Martin said quietly, still watching as Greg disappeared into his house. Sarah nodded, but her expression was worried. What if? She started, then stopped herself. After a moment, she tried again. What if we find out something we wish we hadn't? The question hung in the air between them. Martin thought about their quiet life, about Ben playing in the backyard, about the peaceful neighborhood they'd chosen specifically because nothing ever happened here. If they pursued this, if they discovered something truly wrong was going on, all of that could change. But the alternative, ignoring what they were seeing, pretending everything was normal while something potentially terrible was happening just yards from their home, seemed impossible now. They were in too deep, had seen too much to just look away. Over the next few days, they developed a system. Sarah would keep track of Greg's departure times and what he carried, while Martin would watch for his returns and note any changes or unusual behavior. They tried to be discreet about it, taking turns walking their dog at strategic times, doing yard work that gave them clear views of Greg's house, or sitting on their back porch in the evenings. The more they watched, the more disturbing details they noticed. Sometimes Greg would talk to himself as he walked, his lips moving in what looked like the same patterns over and over, like he was reciting something. Other times, he'd stand at the edge of his property for long minutes before heading into the woods, as if gathering courage or waiting for something. One evening, While pretending to water the flowers near their property line, Sarah overheard Greg on his phone. He was speaking in a low, urgent voice. "It has to be tonight." "No, I can't wait." "Yes, I know what I'm doing. I've done it before." When he noticed Sarah, he quickly ended the call and went inside. That conversation shook them both. "Done what before?" Martin kept asking, pacing their kitchen after Sarah told him about it. The implications were becoming harder to ignore. The missing person case from the nearby town stayed in the back of their minds, and now they found themselves looking up other similar cases in the area. They found more than they expected. Over the past few years, there had been a handful of unexplained disappearances within a 30-mile radius. None of the cases were officially connected, but reading through the details, Martin and Sarah started seeing patterns. Most of the disappearances happened in the evening or at night. The missing people's cars were often found in public places, like shopping centers or park-and-ride lots. And in several cases, personal items belonging to the missing people were never found. "We should tell someone," Sarah said one night after they'd watched Greg return from another late excursion. "The police? Maybe?" But Martin hesitated. "Tell them what? That our neighbor takes walks in the woods at night? That he carries a bag and sometimes gets muddy? We don't have any actual evidence of anything." They both knew he was right. Everything they'd observed could have innocent explanations. The phone call could have been about anything. The tools Sarah had glimpsed might have been for some hobby they didn't know about. The mud and stains could be from perfectly normal activities. But they also both knew they didn't believe any of those explanations anymore. Something was happening in those woods, something that required darkness and secrecy, something that left Greg looking haunted and guilty when he returned. The question now wasn't whether they should do something about it, but what they could do. "I could follow him," Martin suggested quietly, late one night when they were both lying awake, thinking about what they'd observed that day. "Just once, just to see where he goes." Sarah turned to look at him in the darkness. "That could be dangerous," she said, but her tone suggested she'd been thinking the same thing. "More dangerous than doing nothing?" Martin asked. They both knew the answer to that. The decision to follow Greg weighed on Martin all week. He and Sarah planned it carefully, choosing a night when Ben would be at his grandmother's house. They didn't want to take any chances with their son around, just in case things went wrong. Sarah would stay home, ready to call someone if Martin didn't check in via text every 30 minutes. Martin spent the day running through scenarios in his head, barely able to focus on work. His hands felt sweaty on his keyboard, and he kept finding himself staring at the woods through his office window. The trees seemed to mock him, their leaves whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. When evening came, Martin changed into dark clothes, nothing too obvious, just a navy hoodie and black jeans. He wore his most comfortable running shoes, thinking he might need to move quickly. Sarah watched him get ready, her face tight with worry. "Maybe we should just call the police," she said again, but they both knew they'd been through this argument already. Without evidence, the police would just think they were paranoid neighbors causing trouble. "I'll be careful," Martin promised, checking his phone's battery one last time. "I won't get too close. Just enough to see where he goes and what he's doing." They waited by the window, watching Greg's house. The sun had set about 20 minutes ago, and the streetlights were casting their usual yellow glow across the quiet neighborhood. Right on schedule, Greg emerged from his side door, bag in hand. Tonight, it looked particularly full, its sides bulging with unknown contents. Martin waited until Greg was halfway to the woods before slipping out his back door. His heart was pounding so hard, he worried Greg might hear it in the quiet evening air. The distance between them felt both too close and too far, close enough that any sound might give him away, but far enough that Greg could disappear into the darkness if Martin wasn't careful. The entrance to the woods was different at night. During the day, it was just a gap between the trees where kids had worn a path. But now it looked like a mouth, ready to swallow anyone who ventured inside. Martin hesitated for just a moment before following Greg's shadowy figure into the darkness. The woods seemed to close around them immediately. The streetlight's glow barely penetrated the canopy, leaving only patches of dim light scattered across the ground. Martin had to move carefully to avoid stepping on twigs or dry leaves, each potential sound feeling like it could echo through the entire forest. Greg moved with surprising confidence through the darkness, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. He barely paused at trail junctions, taking turns without hesitation. Martin realized Greg must have made this journey hundreds of times to move so surely in such low light. The main trail gradually became narrower, less defined. Greg veered off onto what looked like a game trail, barely visible in the growing darkness. Martin had to slow down, worried about losing his footing on the uneven ground. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise. The quiet was oppressive. No cars, no distant voices, not even many natural sounds, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the slight breeze and the soft sound of their footsteps. Martin's breathing seemed impossibly loud in his own ears, and he found himself taking shallow breaths, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Ahead, Greg stopped suddenly. Martin froze, pressing himself against a tree trunk, hoping the darkness would hide him. For a terrible moment, he thought Greg had heard him. But Greg was just adjusting something in his bag, the contents making a dull clinking sound that Martin couldn't quite identify. As they moved deeper into the woods, Martin started to lose track of direction. He'd grown up in this area and thought he knew these woods well, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees seemed older here, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The undergrowth was thicker, making it harder to move quietly. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes, Martin noticed a faint light ahead. At first, he thought it might be moonlight breaking through the canopy, but as they got closer, he realized it was artificial, the warm glow of a lantern or flashlight. Greg's pace slowed as they approached the light. Martin hung back further, knowing the light would make him more visible if he got too close. He found a spot behind a thick tree where he could observe without being seen, his back pressed against rough bark. The source of the light turned out to be a battery-powered lantern placed on the ground in a small clearing. Martin's eyes widened as he took in the scene. The clearing wasn't natural. The ground had been cleared deliberately, the earth packed down from repeated use. But it was what was in the clearing that made Martin's blood run cold. Wooden crosses dotted the ground, each about 2 feet tall, arranged in no pattern he could discern. They looked handmade, roughly carved but solid. There were maybe a dozen of them, some looking weathered and old, others apparently newer. The lantern's light made their shadows dance across the cleared earth, creating an eerie, shifting pattern. Greg set his bag down carefully, almost reverently, next to one of the newer-looking crosses. Martin watched as he began to unpack it, laying out items on the ground with methodical precision. From his hiding spot, Martin couldn't make out exactly what everything was, but he could see that some objects reflected the lantern light while others seemed to absorb it. The silence was broken by Greg's voice, so unexpected in the quiet that Martin almost jumped. Greg was speaking softly, his words not quite carrying to where Martin hid, but the tone was clear. It had the rhythm of a ritual, like someone reciting a prayer or incantation. Martin's phone vibrated silently in his pocket, Sarah's check-in text. He ignored it, afraid even that small movement might give him away. His legs were starting to cramp from staying still for so long, but he didn't dare move. Every instinct told him he was witnessing something he wasn't meant to see. Greg knelt beside one of the crosses, still murmuring, and began to arrange items around its base. In the lantern light, Martin could now make out more details. There was something that looked like a watch, its band dirty, but its face catching the light. Next to it, Greg placed what appeared to be a hairbrush, its bristles matted with dirt. A sudden realization hit Martin like a physical blow. These weren't random items, they were personal belongings, possessions, memories. Each cross wasn't just a marker, it was a memorial, or a trophy. The implications of what he was seeing started to sink in, making his stomach churn. The missing persons reports, the late-night excursions, the mysterious bag, it all started to form a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Martin's foot shifted slightly, trying to relieve the growing ache in his muscles. A twig snapped under his shoe, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet clearing. Greg's head snapped up, his murmuring cutting off mid-word. Martin held his breath, pressing himself harder against the tree trunk, willing himself to become part of the shadows. Greg's eyes scanned the darkness, and for a moment, Martin was sure he'd been spotted. But after what felt like an eternity, Greg turned back to his task, though his movements seemed more hurried now. He pulled out one final object, a photograph, its edges dirty and worn, and placed it carefully beside one of the crosses. Martin knew he had to leave. He had what he came for, proof that something very wrong was happening in these woods. But as he started to slowly back away, his phone vibrated again in his pocket. Sarah would be getting worried now, maybe even panicked. He needed to get out of there, back to the safety of their home, where they could figure out what to do with what he'd discovered. Martin's legs shook as he tried to back away from the clearing without making another sound. Every muscle in his body felt tight with fear, but he forced himself to move slowly, deliberately. One wrong step now could be disastrous. From his new position, slightly further back in the darkness, he could still see Greg continuing his bizarre ritual. The man's movements had taken on an almost mechanical precision, like someone following steps they'd performed countless times before. Each item was placed with careful attention to its position, adjusted until it sat just right. The murmuring had started again, but this time Martin could catch fragments of what Greg was saying. The words seemed to be names, dates, and something that sounded like apologies. Karen, October 15th. I had to. David, December 3rd. Forgive me. The litany made Martin's skin crawl. Each name seemed to correspond to an item being placed, like some twisted catalog of memories. The watch Greg had placed caught the lantern light again, and Martin recognized its design. It was similar to one he'd seen in a news report about the missing woman from the nearby town. The report had mentioned she was wearing a silver watch with a distinctive blue face when she disappeared. The watch by the cross had the same blue face, though now it was scratched and dirty. Greg reached into his bag again, pulling out something wrapped in what looked like an old cloth. As he unwrapped it, Martin could see it was a small box, worn and weathered but obviously once expensive. Greg opened it carefully, revealing something that glinted in the lantern light. Jewelry maybe, or keys. Whatever it was, Greg handled it like it was precious, dangerous, or both. The ritual continued, with Greg moving from cross to cross, leaving small items at each one. Some crosses had multiple objects arranged around them, while others had just one or two. Martin noticed that the newer-looking crosses had cleaner, less weathered items around them. The older crosses' tributes looked more degraded, as if they'd been exposed to the elements for months or even years. A sudden breeze stirred the leaves overhead, making the lantern light flicker. The shadows of the crosses seemed to move, like dark fingers reaching across the cleared ground. The wind carried the smell of dirt and decay, and something else, something metallic that made Martin's stomach turn. Greg's voice had gotten louder, more intense. The names were coming faster now, mixed with phrases that made no sense to Martin. How to make it right? They wouldn't understand. Each one special. Each one chosen. The words had a rhythmic quality, almost like a chant or song, but twisted and wrong. Martin's phone buzzed again in his pocket, the third time now. Sarah would be frantic. He needed to leave, to get back to her, to figure out what to do with what he'd discovered. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen as he watched this horrific ceremony unfold. Around each cross, Martin could now see that the ground was subtly different, slightly raised in some places, disturbed in others. The realization of what that might mean hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just memorials. They were markers. Each cross might be marking something, or someone buried beneath. Greg's movements became more erratic as his ritual progressed. He started touching each cross before moving to the next one, his fingers trailing over the rough wood like he was greeting old friends. The names kept coming, but now they were mixed with locations and what sounded like explanations. The parking lot at Miller's Grove had to be done, the trail behind the library, no choice. Each location Greg mentioned sparked a connection in Martin's mind to news reports he'd read about local disappearances. The parking lot at Miller's Grove, wasn't that where they'd found that missing jogger's car last year? The library trail had been mentioned in another case, though Martin couldn't remember the details now. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, making the lantern flame dance wildly. The shadows of the crosses stretched and twisted across the clearing, creating nightmarish patterns on the ground. In that shifting light, Martin saw something that made his heart stop. What looked like fresh dirt piled slightly to one side of the clearing, near where Greg had been working. Greg moved to this newest spot, his movements becoming more purposeful again. He reached into his bag one final time and pulled out something that made a metallic sound when it hit the ground, a key ring with several keys attached. Even from his hiding spot, Martin could see that some of the keys looked new, while others were tarnished with age. "The newest one," Greg muttered, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Still so fresh. Still so." He trailed off, arranging the keys carefully on the ground. "They'll never find you here. Safe now. All of you, safe." Martin's foot had gone numb from standing so still for so long. He tried to shift his weight slightly, to restore circulation without making a sound, but his shoe scraped against a root, creating a soft but distinct sound in the quiet clearing. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkness. This time, he didn't look away. He rose slowly from his kneeling position, his gaze fixed somewhere near Martin's hiding spot. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice different now, harder, colder than the almost gentle tone he'd been using during his ritual. Martin held perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, and he silently cursed himself for not turning it off completely. The vibration seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Greg took a step toward the trees where Martin was hiding. "I can't hear you," he said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "Come out. Let's talk about what you've seen." The lantern light caught Greg's face, and Martin saw an expression there that would haunt him forever, a mixture of resignation and something else, something hungry and dark. Greg's hands were dirty from his work with the memorial items, and in the flickering light, the dirt looked almost black. "You don't understand," Greg continued, taking another step forward. "Nobody understands. But they're safe now. All of them. Safe and quiet." His voice had taken on that rhythmic quality again, but now it sent chills down Martin's spine. "Maybe you need to be safe too." Martin knew he had to move, had to run, but fear kept him frozen in place. Greg was still advancing slowly, his eyes searching the darkness. The shadows from the crosses seemed to reach toward Martin like grasping hands, and the wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in the clearing. Martin didn't remember running home. His memory of leaving the woods was a blur of branches whipping past his face and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He burst through his back door, startling Sarah, who had been pacing in the kitchen, phone in hand. "Martin," she rushed to him, taking in his wild eyes and scratched face. "I was about to call the police." "What happened?" "You stopped answering my texts and dash. We need to look something up." Martin cut her off, already moving to his laptop on the kitchen table. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely type. "The missing persons cases. All of them. We need dates, locations, everything." Sarah sat next to him, her face pale in the kitchen's fluorescent light. "What did you see out there?" Martin's fingers hovered over the keyboard as the images from the clearing flashed through his mind. "Crosses," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dozens of them. And items, personal things. A watch, a hairbrush, keys." He looked at Sarah, seeing his own horror reflected in her eyes. "They're trophies, Sarah. Or markers. Or both." They spent the next several hours hunched over the laptop, searching through local news archives and missing persons databases. Martin created a spreadsheet, inputting everything they could find about disappearances within a 30-mile radius over the past 5 years. Sarah made coffee they didn't drink, both too wired with adrenaline and fear to need it. Patterns emerged as they worked. Most victims had disappeared in the evening or at night. Their vehicles were often found in public places, just like the woman from the recent case. And in almost every instance, key personal items were never recovered: watches, jewelry, phones. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an article from 2 years ago. "David Chun, disappeared December 3rd. Her voice shook slightly. "That was one of the names you heard Greg saying." Martin added it to their growing list. The connections were becoming impossible to ignore. The locations Greg had mentioned in his ritual matched up with where victims had last been seen or where their belongings had been found. The timing of the disappearances often coincided with periods when they'd noticed Greg's behavior becoming more erratic. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, staring at their collection of evidence. "This is enough, isn't it? We have dates, locations, names." Martin ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing. But no proof. Nothing concrete that connects Greg to any of this. Just my word about what I saw in the woods, and a bunch of circumstantial connections we made from public information. A soft sound from outside made them both freeze. Through the kitchen window, they could see Greg's house. A light had just turned on upstairs. Martin checked the time, 3:47 a.m. They'd been researching for hours. Sarah pulled the curtains closed, even though they were already sitting in near darkness. "What if he saw you?" she whispered. "What if he knows you were there?" The question hung in the air between them. Martin thought about Greg's final words in the clearing. "Maybe you need to be safe too." The memory made him shiver. They spent the rest of the night documenting everything they could remember. Martin drew a rough map of the clearing, marking where each cross had been placed. Sarah compiled news articles, missing persons reports, and their own observations of Greg's behavior over the past months. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across their kitchen table covered in notes and printouts, they faced the reality of their situation. They had uncovered something horrific, but proving it would be another matter entirely. "We can't just go to the police and tell them our neighbor is burying evidence in the woods," Martin said, rubbing his tired eyes. "They'll think we're crazy. We need something concrete." Sarah was scrolling through another news article on her phone. "What about this?" 3 months ago, a woman went missing from the shopping center on Oak Street. The police report mentions she was wearing a distinctive watch, silver with a blue face. She looked up at Martin. "The same watch you saw in the clearing?" Martin nodded slowly. "But we can't prove that's the same watch. We can't prove anything without going back there, and that's..." He trailed off, remembering the way Greg had moved through the darkness with such familiar ease. "No," Sarah said firmly, reading his thoughts. "You're not going back there. It's too dangerous. He might be waiting, expecting someone to return." They heard a car door slam outside, and both jumped. Through a gap in the curtains, they could see Greg loading something into his trunk. He was dressed for work, looking completely normal in the morning light, just another neighbor heading out for the day. "How can he do that?" Sarah whispered. "Just go about his day like nothing happened?" Martin watched as Greg backed out of his driveway, giving a friendly wave to another neighbor walking their dog. "Practice," he said grimly. "Years of practice." They spent the morning going through their evidence again, trying to find something, anything, that would be concrete enough to take to the authorities. The dates lined up. The locations matched. Even some of the items Martin had seen in the clearing corresponded with descriptions in police reports. But it all felt circumstantial. They could connect the dots because they knew what they were looking for, but would anyone else see the pattern? Would anyone believe them without hard evidence? Sarah started making calls, careful to use her work phone rather than their home line. She contacted local police departments, asking for updates on old missing persons cases, claiming to be a journalist working on a story. Most departments gave her the same response. Cases were still open, but there were no new leads. "We need to think about Ben," Sarah said finally, closing her laptop. "If Greg saw you, if he suspects anything, we're not safe here." Martin looked out the window at their quiet suburban street, now transformed in his mind from a peaceful sanctuary into something more sinister. How many people had Greg watched from his window, just as Martin had watched him? How did he choose? "We can't just leave," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "If we run, if we don't stop him..." "We can't stop him without proof," Sarah countered. "And we can't get proof without putting ourselves in danger." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We need help. Professional help." Martin waited until sunset, ignoring Sarah's pleas to reconsider. They'd spent the day making preparations, sending Ben to stay with his grandmother for a surprise weekend visit, packing essential documents into a go bag, and setting up Sarah's old phone to record video. The new phone, with its better camera and full battery, would go with Martin. "This is stupid," Sarah said for the 10th time. watching him check the phone settings. "We should just leave. Call the police from somewhere safe. If we leave now, he'll know something's wrong," Martin replied, tucking the phone into his jacket pocket. "He'll clean everything up, and those families will never know what happened to their loved ones." He didn't add what they were both thinking, that Greg might just start over somewhere else, with new woods and new crosses. The plan was simple, maybe too simple. Martin would return to the clearing, photograph everything, and get out. Quick and quiet. Sarah would wait in the car 2 blocks away, engine running, ready for a fast exit if needed. They'd drive straight to the police station in the next town over, where they had no connection to Greg and might be more willing to listen. Martin checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. Greg usually started his evening ritual around 9. That gave Martin enough time to get into position and wait. He'd chosen this night carefully, knowing from their observations that Greg often visited the clearing on Thursdays. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you run," Sarah said, hugging him tightly. "Promise me?" "I promise," Martin said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He touched the phone in his pocket like a talisman. 2 hours max. "If I'm not back by then, I'm calling every police department in the state," Sarah finished. They'd been over this part of the plan repeatedly. The walk to the woods felt different this time. Martin's fear had crystallized into something harder, more focused. Each step was deliberate, planned. He'd memorized the path from his previous trip, noting landmarks even in his panic. The old oak with the split trunk, the cluster of rocks that looked like a turtle, the fallen birch that crossed the trail. The darkness beneath the trees seemed thicker than before, but Martin forced himself forward. He'd brought a small flashlight, but didn't dare use it yet. His eyes would adjust, and the moon provided just enough light to navigate by. The sound of footsteps ahead made him freeze. Greg was early. Martin quickly stepped off the trail, crouching behind a thick bush. Greg passed within feet of him, bags swinging at his side, muttering something under his breath. Martin waited until Greg was far enough ahead before following. The distance between them was closer than he'd planned, making every step treacherous. One wrong move, one snapped twig, could give him away. The clearing looked different in the moonlight. The crosses cast longer shadows, their rough shapes more ominous, without the warm glow of Greg's lantern. Martin could see fresh dirt near one edge of the clearing, a new addition since his last visit. He waited until Greg set up his lantern and became absorbed in his ritual before slipping the phone from his pocket. The camera made no sound as he started recording, capturing Greg's methodical movements as he arranged his tools and trinkets. Martin slowly circled the edge of the clearing, keeping to the shadows, recording everything. He documented each cross, each carefully placed item, trying to get clear shots despite the dim light. The phone's screen showed him things his eyes had missed, subtle patterns in the arrangement of the crosses, small mounds of earth that might have gone unnoticed. Greg's voice carried clearly in the still night air as he performed his ritual. Martin made sure to capture the audio, knowing the names and dates Greg mentioned could be crucial evidence. Each name felt like a weight on Martin's conscience. People who had families searching for them, answers buried here in these dark woods. Something metallic glinted near one of the newer crosses. Martin zoomed in with his phone's camera, trying to get a better look. It was the key he'd seen Greg unearth earlier. Car keys, house keys, office keys. Each one representing a life interrupted, a story cut short. He was so focused on getting the shot that he didn't notice the change in Greg's voice, didn't realize the muttering had stopped. When he looked up from his phone screen, Greg was staring directly at him, the lantern light casting strange shadows across his face. "I wondered if you'd come back," Greg said quietly. His tone was almost friendly, like he was greeting a neighbor over a fence. Most people would have run away and never looked back. But not you, Martin. You had to know more, didn't you? Martin's fingers tightened around the phone, still recording. He began to back away slowly, trying to keep Greg in frame while looking for an escape route. "It's funny," Greg continued, taking a step forward. "I've watched you watching me all these months. Such attention to detail. Such dedication." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're not so different, you and I. We both need to understand things, to make sense of them. Why? The question escaped Martin's lips before he could stop it. Why did you do it? Greg's expression changed, becoming almost serene. They were lost, he said simply. All of them, lost in their own ways. I helped them find peace. He gestured to the crosses around him. Here, they're safe. Protected. Remembered. Martin's back hit a tree. He'd run out of room to retreat. Greg was between him and the main trail, and the undergrowth on either side was too thick to run through in the dark. The phone won't help, Greg said, nodding at Martin's hand. Even if you get out of here with it, who's going to believe what it shows? A man laying flowers at some crosses in the woods? Playing with trinkets? His voice hardened. But you had to push, didn't you? Had to dig deeper. Martin's mind raced. Sarah was waiting in the car. If he could just get past Greg, get to the trail. I've been careful, Greg continued, moving closer. So careful, for so long. Each one chosen perfectly. Each story ended cleanly. His eyes gleamed in the lantern light. But you're messy, Martin. You're a loose end. Greg reached into his bag, and Martin saw something metallic flash in his hand. You should have stayed home, Greg said softly. Should have minded your own business. Now you'll have to stay here too. Safe. Protected. Remember Dash? A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, making them both turn. The moment of distraction was all Martin needed. He bolted, not toward the trail but into the undergrowth, crashing through branches and thorns. Behind him, he heard Greg shout, heard footsteps pursuing him through the darkness. Martin ran blindly, his phone screen providing brief flashes of light that did more harm than good. Branches whipped at his face, roots tried to trip him, but terror kept him moving. He could hear Greg behind him, moving more surely through the familiar territory. The next morning, Martin sat at his kitchen table, staring at his coffee but not drinking it. His hands still trembled slightly, and the scratches on his face and arms stung from the antiseptic Sarah had applied after his frantic return to the car last night. They hadn't gone to the police yet. The video on Martin's phone was dark and shaky, the audio distorted. Without context, it looked exactly as Greg had said it would, just a man in the woods with some crosses and trinkets. Even Greg's confession about helping people find peace could be explained away as the ramblings of an eccentric but harmless man. You need to eat something, Sarah said, putting toast in front of him. She hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. They'd spent the night at a motel on the highway, too afraid to return home until daylight. Martin pushed the toast away. Every noise made him jump. The refrigerator humming, a car passing outside, the neighbor's dog barking. The normal sounds of their suburban morning felt wrong now, like a mask covering something darker. He was in his front yard when we drove past, Sarah said quietly, watering his flowers like nothing happened. He waved at me. Martin's stomach churned. He could still hear Greg's voice, so calm and reasonable in the darkness. We're not so different, you and I. The worst part was understanding what Greg had meant. Hadn't Martin spent months watching, observing, gathering information? The parallel made him feel sick. They'd already called Ben's grandmother, asking her to keep him for a few more days. Just until we sort some things out, Sarah had said, trying to keep her voice steady. They couldn't bring their son back here, not with Greg just 3 houses away, not with those woods looming behind their property. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Martin's heart hammered in his chest until Sarah peeked through the curtains and whispered, "It's just Mrs. Patterson from across the street." But even that wasn't reassuring anymore. How well did they really know any of their neighbors? Had Greg seemed strange to anyone else? Or had they all been as blind as Martin and Sarah had been at first? Sarah opened the door just enough to be polite, chatting briefly about borrowed garden tools or something equally mundane. Martin couldn't focus on the conversation. His eyes kept drifting to the windows, expecting to see Greg's face peering in at them. When Sarah closed the door, she leaned against it, looking as exhausted as Martin felt. "We can't stay here," she said. It wasn't the first time she'd said it since last night, but now the words carried more weight. "If we leave, he wins," Martin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He'll just keep going, keep adding crosses." Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand. Her grip was tight, almost painful. If we stay, we could end up as cross as ourselves. You heard him last night. He thinks of it as helping people, Martin. In his mind, he's doing something good. Throughout the day, they watched Greg's house through gaps in their curtains. He went about his normal routine, checking his mail, tidying his yard, even chatting with a delivery person. But now they could see how perfect his performance was, how carefully crafted each normal action appeared. Martin noticed things he'd missed before. How Greg's eyes would scan his surroundings while appearing to casually look around. How he positioned himself to always have a clear view of his environment. How his friendly waves and smiles never quite reached his eyes. "He's watching us too," Sarah whispered, pulling Martin away from the window. "He knows we're here, knows we're afraid." They spent the afternoon moving through their house like ghosts, speaking in whispers even though they knew Greg couldn't possibly hear them. Martin tried to work, but every email, every mundane computer problem from his clients seemed absurd now. How could he focus on printer settings when he knew what was hiding in those woods? Sarah found footprints in their backyard while checking that all the windows were locked. They looked fresh, and they hadn't come from their shoes. "He's been here," she said, her voice shaking. "While we were at the motel, he was in our yard." The discovery sent them into a frenzy of checking and double-checking locks, closing blinds, looking for any sign of tampering. Had Greg been in their house? Had he left something behind? Every shadow held potential threats now, every closed door the possibility of someone waiting behind it. Their phones seemed to mock them. They had evidence, shaky, unclear evidence that could be explained away, but they knew the truth. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything else. "Maybe we should just show the police what we have," Sarah suggested, but her tone said she already knew the answer. The video was too dark, the audio too garbled. Without concrete evidence, it would be their word against Greg's, and he'd had years to perfect his normal, friendly neighbor act. As evening approached, they ordered delivery food neither of them could eat. The delivery driver's arrival made them both jump, and Martin insisted on checking through the peephole 3 times before opening the door. The sun began to set, and with the darkness came new fears. Would Greg visit his crosses tonight? Would he come for them instead? Every creak of their house settling sounded like footsteps. Every shadow could be a figure standing just out of sight. "I keep thinking about those families," Martin said, breaking a long silence. "All those people searching for answers, not knowing their loved ones are buried in those woods, not knowing they're just a few hundred yards from our backyard." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We can't help them if we're dead," she said bluntly. "We need to be smart about this. We need a plan." But planning seemed impossible when they couldn't trust their own home, their own neighborhood. The life they'd built here, the quiet streets, the friendly neighbors, the safe suburb for raising their son, had become a facade, hiding something rotten at its core. As night fully settled in, they sat in their dimly lit living room, neither willing to go upstairs to bed. The woods behind their house seemed to press against their windows, dark and knowing. Somewhere in those trees, crosses stood in their clearing, keeping their silent vigil over Greg's victims. And Greg, in his house just 3 doors down, might be watching, waiting, planning his next move. "We have to protect Ben," Sarah whispered into the darkness. It was the one thing they were both absolutely certain about. Whatever they decided to do next, their son's safety had to come first. Martin nodded, his eyes fixed on the window, watching for movement in the night. They couldn't stay here, couldn't live with this knowledge and this fear. But leaving meant Greg would continue his ritual, adding more crosses, more victims to his twisted collection. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. They made the decision at dawn, after another sleepless night. The moving company would come tomorrow, and they'd already found a short-term rental in another city. Sarah called it a sudden job opportunity when she told the neighbors. Their voices were bright, their smiles practiced, but their hands shook as they packed boxes. Martin took a sick day from work, unable to focus on anything but watching Greg's house. He noticed Greg had changed his routine slightly. Now he checked his mailbox more frequently, each time scanning the street with careful, measuring looks. Once, their eyes met through the windows, and Greg smiled and waved, the gesture so normal it was terrifying. The packing felt surreal. How do you pack up a life you're running from? Which memories do you take, and which do you leave behind? Sarah moved through the house like a tornado, throwing things into boxes without much organization. Martin found himself staring at objects, wondering if they'd ever seem normal again. Ben's baseball trophies, family photos, the wind chimes they'd bought at that craft fair last summer. "We need to tell someone," Martin said, holding a framed photo of Ben at his last birthday party. "We can't just leave knowing what we know." Sarah paused in her packing. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what proof do we have? That video barely shows anything, but they both knew they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't try. After hours of discussion, they decided to send anonymous letters to the families of the missing people, telling them to push the police to search the woods behind Maple Street. They wouldn't mention Greg, wouldn't mention the crosses, just enough information to point investigators in the right direction. As they wrote the letters, Martin thought about each cross in the clearing. Each life ended too soon. He remembered Greg's words about helping people find peace, and wondered how someone could twist reality so completely that murder became a kind of twisted kindness. The day passed in a blur of boxes and bubble wrap. Their neighbors stopped by to express surprise at their sudden move, and each conversation felt like walking through a minefield. They stuck to their story about Sarah's job opportunity, but Martin wondered if anyone could see the fear behind their forced smiles. Greg appeared in his yard several times throughout the day, each appearance sending Martin and Sarah into a brief panic. He did nothing threatening, just normal yard work, checking his mail, washing his car. But they knew it was all for show now, a performance for the neighborhood. As evening approached, the moving company called to confirm their arrival time for tomorrow. The house was mostly packed, their lives reduced to labeled boxes and bubble-wrapped furniture. Ben's room was the hardest to pack, each toy and book a reminder of the childhood innocence they were trying to protect. "Almost done," Sarah said, sealing another box. Her voice was tired but determined. They decided to sleep at another motel tonight, not willing to spend one more night in the house. The motel wasn't far, but it felt like a different world, one where crosses didn't wait in dark woods and neighbors didn't hide horrible secrets. Just before sunset, as they were loading the last few boxes into their car for the night, Martin noticed something in their mailbox, a small white envelope with no stamp or address. His hands trembled as he opened it, already knowing who it was from. The note inside was simple. "Some things are best left buried." The words hit him like a physical blow. Greg knew they were leaving, knew they were afraid, and now he was letting them know he'd won. They could run, but they'd carry the secret with them forever. Sarah found Martin standing in the driveway, still holding the note. She read it over his shoulder, her face paling in the fading light. Without a word, she took his hand and led him to the car. They'd come back tomorrow with the movers, but for now, they needed to get away from this place, away from Greg and his woods full of crosses. As they drove away, Martin looked in the rearview mirror. Greg stood in his front yard, watering his flowers as if it were any other evening. He looked up as they passed, giving them that same neighborly wave he'd given 1,000 times before. But now Martin could see what lay behind that friendly gesture, the darkness that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. They chose a different motel this time, farther from the neighborhood. As they lay in the unfamiliar bed, neither sleeping, Sarah whispered, "Do you think the police will find anything when they search the woods?" Martin thought about how carefully Greg had maintained his secret, how methodically he'd constructed his normal life. "I don't know," he admitted, "but at least we tried. At least we didn't just walk away." The next day, they supervised the movers with mechanical efficiency, going through the motions of a normal relocation. Their neighbors came by to say goodbye, and each farewell felt like a betrayal, leaving these people unknowingly living next to a monster. Greg wasn't home when they did their final walkthrough of the house. But as they stood in their empty driveway for the last time, Martin saw movement at Greg's window, just a slight shift of curtains, but enough to know they were being watched. The drive to their new rental felt like escaping, like finally breaking free from a nightmare. But Martin knew the truth. They weren't really escaping. They'd carry this with them, this knowledge of what people could hide behind normal facades and friendly waves. That night, in their temporary new home, Sarah found Martin standing at the window, staring into the darkness. "What are you looking for?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I guess I'm just making sure there aren't any woods nearby." They both knew they'd never look at quiet suburban neighborhoods the same way again. They'd never trust a friendly neighbor without question, never see woods as just trees. The world had changed for them, become darker and more dangerous. Weeks later, they saw a small article in their old town's newspaper. Police had searched the woods behind Maple Street after receiving anonymous tips. They found nothing, no crosses, no disturbed earth, no signs of Greg's ritual ground. He'd cleaned it all away, just as they'd feared he would. But sometimes, late at night, Martin would think about those crosses, about the families still searching for answers, about Greg still living in that gray house with the perfect hedges. And he'd wonder if someone else would notice the neighbor who walked into the woods at sunset, carrying a bag full of memories that weren't his to keep. The suburbs called to people like them, families looking for safety, for normalcy, for a place to raise their children away from the dangers of the world. But Martin and Sarah now knew that sometimes the most dangerous things hide in the most normal places, behind the friendliest smiles and the neatest hedges. They had escaped with their lives and their son's safety, but they'd lost something too: their belief in the simple safety of suburban life, their trust in the basic goodness of their neighbors. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Some knowledge changes you forever.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.